Okay, so so here we go, and welcome you all. And we are going to start with this Defensa de tesis by Constanza Quinteros, who worked an interesting problem that she found in her own experience as a language learner, and not only as a language learner of English, but she tried other languages, and that was how her interest in polyglots came up. Okay, so she wrote a thesis by the name "A Multilingual Learner's Complex and Dynamic Metacognitive System, Examined through the Reconstruction of His Language Learning History, a Single Case Study from a Socio-Cognitive Ecological Perspectives." So here in the title, you see that she's introducing new perspectives to take a look at second language acquisition. Okay, so the idea is that Constanza presents her major findings in not longer than 20 minutes. And then if you have questions, Tammy and Paul, you ask the questions and Constanza answers, and then we will ask Constanza to leave us alone, the three of us, to come up with an evaluation for her presentation. Okay, so in this in this committee, we have the participation of Dr. Tammy Gregerson, who is right now teaching in the United Arab Emirates, but taking a vacation now in the US. And we have also the a contribution of Dr. Paul Abraham from Simmons University in Boston, Massachusetts. And the two of them, both Dr. Gregerson and Dr. Abraham, are visiting professors to the master's program in linguistics, and they have taught courses in the past, and we hope to keep this relationship in the future. Okay, so with no more words, Constanza, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm still excited to be here. This is a culmination of a long cycle for me. Professor Farias and Professor Abraham know that I started with a very different background, that of a historian. And finally, I'm getting some academic recognition as a linguist, although I've been working as a linguist for quite some time now. So this moment feels like I'm finally getting the key to this world of this academic world of linguistics. So I'm very excited about that. So here comes my final presentation. The thesis is called, as Professor said, A Multilingual Learner's Complex and Dynamic Metacognitive System, Examined through the Reconstruction of His Language Learning History. And it was a single case study from a socio-cognitive ecological perspective. Since you all read my thesis and you're informed, and I would want to avoid some redundancies, I will present my thesis in a slightly different manner. Although there are many layers to it, my thesis was mostly a narrative, a representation of someone's history with languages as seen with a closer lens. So today I want to present my thesis in a similar way with three layers, which I will call the past, containing my motivation and my thesis project, the eternal present, which will contain the study and the results and conclusions, and the future, in which I will tell you about some limitations of the study and some projections that I have to do after I conclude this cycle. So let's begin with the past. What happened before I wrote this work? I had a motivation to understand multilingual subjects in the widest possible manner. And as a multilingual myself, or at least as an aspiring multilingual, I was in constant search for the most efficient methods for language learning. And at a certain point it worked, because I started learning German, and after around 6 months, I could hold a normal conversation with German natives. It wasn't like physics or anything fancy, but I could communicate. And that really sparked some curiosity in me on how to make it even better. At that moment, when I was learning German, I had already met Professor Farias, and he had introduced me to the different theories of second language acquisition, which was a topic that not only drew my imagination then, but became the most interesting and important matter for me during these 3 years. I wanted to understand everything that may happen when someone is learning a language and find out if it was possible to enhance this experience, the learner's experience. However big this enterprise may sound, I think this is a motivation that I still hold and I intend to pursue in future endeavors. In my first thesis semester, my goal was to build a project. I needed a framework that allowed me to understand these learners in the most detailed and wide manner possible. That is why I felt drawn to complex and dynamic systems theory. It seemed like the right framework to build a holistic understanding of multilingual learners. I was indeed going to analyze multilingual data, so that implied understanding the characteristics of these particular subjects and how they had been studied so far. Since my focus was going to be on the learner's practices, I decided to study the phenomenon under the concept of metacognition, that is, their thinking about thinking. Furthermore, since I intended to provide a holistic understanding of these subjects, I based my analysis on the Douglas Fir Group proposals of a learner's ecology, something that was introduced to me as part of SLA, or Second Language Acquisition Studies. I wanted to observe all the environmental elements that could characterize a single learning process. Along with this, metacognition would allow me to observe the practices and the thinking processes of learners in a very pragmatic manner. That is, what they did or what they think they had to do, or they thought they had to do in order to learn languages. What we see in this slide is the way I finally structured the theoretical framework. Always thinking about providing a complex and dynamic picture of the phenomena, I set off to understanding the main issues regarding multilingualism, metacognition, and language learning ecology. This allowed me to understand some important controversies, as the one mentioned by De Angelis and Sampieri regarding the bilingual bias, that is, considering multilinguals as bilinguals with more languages in their minds, or the issue in generative linguistics regarding access to universal grammar in multilingual learning. In terms of metacognition, I got to propose a way of thinking about metacognition as a complex and dynamic system that is embedded in the subject's cognitive system and overall learning ecology. And through the Douglas Fir Group's proposal of a learner's ecology, I got to imagine the different layers and multiple elements that take part in any experience of multilingual learning. So that's how I built my theoretical framework, through the perspective of a complex dynamic systems theory. In this slide, you can see my research problem. Although there are theoretical notions as to the complexity of the multilingual language learning process, there are no studies that allow us to see multilingual language development and specifically metacognition within a particular subject. So that's what I meant with this microscopic perspective on the process of language learning. For me, this meant that we needed to reconstruct someone's history with languages and see if this informed our knowledge of language learning in general. In this slide, you can see my objectives. Those were, and this guided the whole research process, to reconstruct the learning process of a multilingual speaker learner in relation to his language learning history and his dynamic learning ecology, to deconstruct and analyze the learner's metacognitive system according to a dynamic systems model, and in a more specific manner, to narrate and describe the subject's language learning history, to give a comprehensive account of the learner's learning ecology, and to describe and account for the subject's metacognitive knowledge, language learning strategies, and other experiential elements within his metacognitive system. So that was the past, or everything that came before I actually started the thesis work. I called the second section of this presentation the eternal present of my thesis. I called it like that because, of course, I will consider that I consider that I will continue to adapt and change, but this work is as it is, and it will remain so in such repositories for who knows how long. So I'm hoping eternally. So in general, what is this work about? It is a study that combined a narrative inquiry and ethnography and a case study methodology. I interviewed multilinguals, reconstructed their history, chose one case that was particularly rich, which was Cristóbal's, and step by step, I reconstructed his dynamic learning ecology and the most salient aspects of his metacognitive system. After this analysis and coding phase, or coding phases for that matter, because there were many layers to the analysis too, I looked for the complex relationships between different aspects in his learning ecology and tried to observe patterns that could inform multilingual language learning. Of course, I was not looking for universal generalizations because my methodology was mostly qualitative. Through this pattern seeking that was drawn from the analysis, I intended to find what Debat and Larsen-Freeman call particular generalizations, which would align with the desire to respect the diversity, the immense diversity of adaptive complex systems like humans, who are learning languages. So what can be more unique than a process like this one? So what you see here is a summary of the steps that I took to go through the research. I found some multilinguals online mostly due to the pandemic. I interviewed them. I checked their proficiency with some tests. I transcribed the interviews, and then came the first layer of the analysis with the coding phase using a software called Atlas.t. And then I did some follow-up interviews just to check that everything was on point and the information was accurate. And then came the second layer of coding and analysis. Then the software allowed me to do some beautiful things with all the data that I collected. And then I set off to writing the thesis. So after these steps that I just showed you, I focused on one particular subject, which was Cristóbal. He was a 35-year-old Chilean historian and museum worker. So we had that in common history. It was a great subject in that regard. He was, He was highly autonomous and he used the internet to engage with other language learners all the time. He defined himself as a language geek. So that was a big marker of his identity too. He has lived in Chile most of his life, but spent some years living in the US. And he also travels extensively through Europe for leisure. He became a fan of traveling, and I feel that it was sort of like his general life goal to visit and to travel around. He reported knowledge of English, Polish, Italian, Basque, and during the interviews, he also mentioned German and French, but he said, and he reported that he didn't really have any proficiency or fluency in these languages. However, it is important to note it because these are languages that would be hypothetically in his mind. The analysis of the interviews yielded 3 important results. First, his learning history, that I built a timeline with it, his learning ecology, which is of course very entrenched to this history, and a deep understanding of the development of his metacognition. I will not delve into Cristóbal's history just for time reasons, but I do have a graphic material in case you want to consult it to ask further questions later. I do want to share some general insights on his learning history and his learning ecology. What we see in this infographic is the first layer of Cristóbal's learning ecology, the micro level of social activity and individual engagement with others. And within cognitive factors that characterize his learning process, we have, of course, his educational development, the presence of multiple languages in his mind, as I just mentioned, and most importantly, the development of his metacognition, a topic that I will take later. Along with these cognitive factors, we must account for the semiotic resources that he interacted with and the real life interactions that he encountered with people, as the one mentioned here, his family, friends, foreign people, sometimes transitory people in his life, but the interactions were quite varied. As I sustained in this thesis, in accordance to a socio-cognitive perspective, especially the social part of socio-cognitive, no language learning happens in isolation. So this was good proof that he needed the scaffold of other people while learning his languages. In this figure, you can see the second layer of sociocultural institutions and communities, and this deepens our understanding of the interactions that our subject had throughout his life. Different educational institutions, universities, schools, and communities, of course, a number of identities that he either took for himself or observed in others. And as the analysis showed, these were very flexible and context dependent. At one moment he was a student, and the other he was a language geek or a polyglot. So that was also adaptive and very typical of an adaptive system, I would say. Finally, we have a macro level of ideological structures. And in this sense, the analysis showed a clear cosmopolitanism, progressivism, and a hybrid approach to education. And I think this speaks a lot about Cristóbal's general conception of the world and himself as a student immersed in a complex socio-political environment. Because with everything that has happened in the last, I want to say 10 years, but probably longer, with the rise in ultra-right movements throughout Europe and the US and Latin America, I think this really influenced Cristóbal's perspective on the importance of learning languages. So he is immersed in this complex socio-political environment. The third part of the analysis referred to my subject's metacognition. And this entails, as was explained in the theoretical framework, observing multiple elements that are part of his metacognitive system, which I categorized in line with most authors in the matter into metacognitive knowledge and metacognitive experiences. Following Flabel and Brown, which are both developmental psychologists, and linguists Stang and Haukas, metacognitive knowledge could be further categorized into person, task, and strategy knowledge. In Cristóbal's learning history, I could observe incremental and adaptive patterns of metacognitive knowledge in all three areas. In these terms, metalinguistic knowledge could be considered one of the most salient elements that scaffolded Cristóbal's advanced learning. I think metalinguistic knowledge, and most importantly, cross-linguistic influence, has been one of the most studied phenomena in L3, LN acquisition studies, particularly from a generativist and cognitive approaches. Yet there's still much to be learned about how transfer works. And I think it is undeniable, but I think it's undeniable that at least in this case, in Cristóbal's case, metalinguistic knowledge and awareness was something that characterized his learning process. In terms of experiences, the analysis was centered in three elements, although only two gave rich results in the analysis. In terms of strategy use, we could see how rich Cristóbal's repertoire was. We can count, for example, strategies such as watching TV with subtitles, reading extensively, chatting with strangers while having beers with them, learning the IPA, recording himself while giving advice to other language learners. And as I mentioned in the thesis, this description of Cristóbal's process proved to me that language learning strategy taxonomies are indeed a little bit outdated and need some refreshing, considering our highly hyper-connected world. So in terms of strategy use, what we see here is a graph regarding the use of strategies by Cristóbal. This is just a summary of the information. We can see a high presence of strategies during his process of learning Polish. Well, in the case of Italian, he was very much worried in enjoying the journey than in applying strategies. Related to his strategic learning, I also accounted for Cristóbal's control mechanisms, which showed the adaptiveness of this learner. And I wanted to build a graph on how his decision-making worked. So in this slide, we can see the process of strategy correction. After a cue from the environment that required problem solving, let's say he wanted to memorize difficult words, Cristóbal makes a decision and applies a strategy. Depending on the outcome, he may accept the results or he may start a new process of decision-making that ends in an adjustment of the strategy. This, of course, is very idealized because of course, sometimes it would require multiple missteps before finding the right strategy. Okay, so of course, in this short presentation, I will not be able to discuss all the details that arose from the analysis, but as part of the conclusions, I would like to highlight some of the main aspects that portray what I achieved during this work. First, I think it was important for me to build a coherent theoretical framework that could stand as a research line for me in the present and the future. The literature review on multilingualism, metacognition, and dynamic systems theory allowed me to build a standing ground that I hope to strengthen with further research. Second, building a language learning history was a great way for me to go back to my roots as a historian and combine these interests in a productive way. And the result, of course, is even more important than this internal issue. The product was observing and learning from other people's histories with languages. And I hope that you can agree with me that listening to Cristóbal, or in your case, reading him, was very enriching. Because people work actively for their goals of learning languages. They get to know themselves, they get to know the task, and they improve as they go. So they learn how to learn. Thirdly, and I think the most important result for me was observing the complexities between the different elements in Cristóbal's learning process. As you know, I used both an inductive and deductive analysis process. I think this was a good idea since I could find my way easily through Cristóbal's learning process with the deductive categories, yet I could also observe new elements that I was not prepared for. The final infographic that I built as a summary of the results was the way in which I tried to give sense to the complexity. Not only do elements interact, but in these successful cases of language learning, we see virtuous relationships, elements that help and enhance one another and enrich the learner's experience. So what you have here is the subject's metacognitive system, metacognitive knowledge, and experiences. Metacognition would be a part of the learner's cognition, and of course, part of his human neurobiological mechanisms. But we have interaction with all ecological elements, as you see in this part of the infographic. And to add to the complexity, we have multilingual repertoires. Not only does he know one extra language, he knows multiple languages. So that adds to the image of complexity. And furthermore, we have the dynamics of the change in time as the system adapts and learns. So I'm very happy with what resulted from this thesis, not only because I was ecstatic to read your comments and feedback, it was also extremely challenging and motivating, and I relished the analysis that it requires. And it is for sure something that I want to continue to do. Which takes me to the future. Of course, there were many limitations to this study. Professor Abraham, in his comments, pointed to how proficiency was tested for this study. And although I do feel that the proficiency test that I built and executed provided valid proof that my subject was indeed a multilingual, I certainly believe that the instruments can and should be improved. Considering the professor's area of expertise, I think it would also be productive to include and to widen my own understanding of what means to be a multilingual and include writing as a variable also, particularly if we consider the world we live in, right? With the amount of interactions that we have online through written mode. We could even say that writing is the new speaking in a sense. A second limitation that Professor Gregerson mentioned on her comments was that of some literature in multilingualism that was not included and that it would be great to consider it in the future. In this sense, I can only think of another analogy, and I'm sorry for the excessive metaphorical thinking. I feel a theoretical framework is like a house you've built for yourself. It should absolutely serve your needs and be strong to stand through the difficulties of life or research in this analogy. As in any house, there is a constant need for restoration and sometimes even a house extension. I believe Professor Gregerson comments point to this particular issue. I can improve my house/theoretical framework, include important pieces of literature as De Whaley and Pavlenko, and as the professor mentioned, take a deep look at who is writing about multilingualism and L3 matters, because I agree with the professor. These are controversial issues sometimes, and it is possible to find resistance when we propose new outlooks. Just to topple the analogy, what I think Professor Gregerson advised for me, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is to both expand my house and prepare for storms, which I'm certain will come my way, and I will hopefully meet them prepared. A third limitation, and I finish my presentation with this, is what I intend to follow up in a doctoral project that I have recently started to prepare. I think the issue of individual differences is fundamental to complement what I intend would be a holistic description of a multilingual learning. I think measuring quantitative variables could only improve this picture. However, what I believe is even more challenging is understanding how can quantitative and qualitative data have a dialogue in our discipline. I'm currently and personally very intrigued as to how to measure metacognition and whether these measurements will have a fluent dialogue with the narrative description of multilingual learning. My first goal, however, is to publish my work as you all advised. Thank you very much for all your comments and feedback, and I look forward to answering your questions as part of this thesis defense. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Constanza, for this wonderful presentation. It was very clear, to me at least. And we're going to take the questions from Dr. Abraham or Dr. Gregerson, if you have any questions or comments. And since Dr. Abraham is further north, we're going to probably start from the most distant.
From north to south, eh? And like in South Carolina, it's quite beautiful here too. It's about 70 degrees as well and sunny. So Constanza, thank you so much for wonderful work and a wonderful presentation. I so much enjoyed reading your work, and it was inspiring, I must say. So I'm very interested in your notion of why the reason you've chosen one particular subject, and you know, if you could talk about that a little bit. You did talk about it in the thesis itself, but also speak about the generalizations from this process, which you alluded to in the presentation as well. So if you could just kind of revisit those two items, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, sure. So when I started this project, the thing that really drew my attention is the way that polyglots and multilinguals designed their study methods. So you could see as many stories as people online regarding strategies that they used. And there's also this sort of dark part of learning strategies is that people try to monetize them, right? They try to capitalize on them. Like, I have the biggest secret for language learning. And that seemed very reductive from my perspective. I saw these people and I said, but that doesn't really necessarily translate to everyone. Like, everyone is different. So when I started this project and I focused on, I started looking to complex dynamic systems theory, and particularly adaptive systems like human beings. And then it really, this uniqueness of experience really resonated in me. And maybe this is a little bit idiosyncratic, or but in my family, my father is a fan of language learning, but he's also a fan of consuming methods. So I would constantly tell him, you can't, if you apply everything, that doesn't mean you're going to have a better result. The issue is to know yourself and to know what you're doing in order for it to work for you. So I think these two issues, one, this personal issue and the theoretical part of the analysis, led me to choose, at the beginning I had multiple subjects. But then I started to realize that if I really wanted to look deep into the patterns, into the elements and their combination, I would have to choose one and go deep into that case. So I thought, what would be richer for my understanding? To include multiple people and see this in a more shallow way, or to really focus on one and see what comes from there. That was part of the decision-making process, for sure.
Sure, that makes sense.
I don't know if I answered both of your questions.
Well, so maybe the broader question of generalizability, you know, now that you've finished this process of deep analysis, how do we move this to some kind of a generalization about language learning? And I think it's there, and maybe you can speak to it.
No, I would like to expand on that, because I think metacognition in particular is a good issue to make these kinds of generalizations. I know it sounds a little redundant, but it's in terms of knowing, I think the general idea is how to promote language learning from the point of view of knowing oneself. So I think maybe that is why I want to follow up this in a doctoral project, just to see other cases and see if metacognition aligns with better language learning. So the fact of, is there a correlation between knowing oneself and really exploring the way one learns and successful language learning? Because that is the hypothesis that I ended up with Cristobal's case. I saw multiple virtual relationships. Does it happen that with other multilinguals, people who have learned multiple languages, do they have more awareness on their learning processes or not? And could we promote this in everywhere, I would think? Get to know yourself and then improve your language learning experience.
Thank you, nicely addressed, thank you.
Thank you for the question.
My turn?
Yes, Tammy.
Hey, okay. You know what? I have, of course, but for the last decade, there's been, a big hoo-la-la about how we define strategy. And you addressed that in your thesis, right? How do you feel with that new tendency towards the idea of not calling something strategy, but rather calling it self-regulation? Does that fit with what you've been dealing with?
I think both categories would complement themselves. I disagree with the theorists that say we should forget about strategies and it's not a valid construct and we should only focus on self-regulation. It doesn't happen the other way around though. Like people that theorize about strategies are not saying we should not research on self-regulation, but I think they are totally complementary. And I think this because self-regulation, from my point of view, would be a part of multilingual awareness. So it's in terms of this complex perspective of metacognition, in terms of seeing all the elements played out, I think they are quite different things. One is an active process that is constantly at work, and strategies are a different kind of construct that has a relationship with the learner's knowledge of strategies, for example, and the process of decision-making. So they are entrenched for sure, but they are different issues. I think we shouldn't be having a blind fight to one of these constructs. I think we should see them as part of a complex and dynamic perspective on metacognition.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Good. Just one other thing, and it's something that's just come to my attention within the last couple of months. I did write on individual differences, and there's a movement now because individual differences is very SLA specific, right? And so when you talk about individual differences, you're definitely entrenched in SLA, right? And there's a new movement now that's much more multidisciplinary, which is called the psychology of language learning and teaching. Right? Mm-hmm. Because what's going on is that there's the SLA crowd who says, okay, you have to talk about language learning and teaching because you can't talk about language learning and teaching as a multidisciplinary idea. It's got to be in SLA, right? Mm-hmm. So whenever I've recently been doing work, everyone has been saying, well, how does that affect the language teacher, right? And so it's this idea that there's some people in the field are really seeking to go out and be much more interdisciplinary, to bring in the sociology, to bring in the history, to bring in different areas, education, for example. And I'm just wondering how you feel about that, because you use the word individual differences, and I'm just wondering if you're open to a more multidisciplinary vision of moving forward with your doctoral dissertation.
Yes, for sure. And I think that is particularly important for me, considering my background, because I am new to this discipline. So I had to adapt very quickly to what was coming. But at the same time, I can't remove my way of thinking in terms of how I was educated in history, in terms of for example, observing the theoretical lines that are at play in a particular discipline. So I totally agree with you. And I think, for example, a couple of years ago, I went to Utrecht, to the University of Utrecht, to do a summer school. And I went to a course called bilingualism there. And it had quite a generativist perspective upon it. And I remember so clearly that they mentioned, okay, bilingualism is, we talked about it, of course, it wasn't as close as I'm describing it now, but at the end, the conclusion was bilingualism means anything beyond the second language. And I think that sort of also made some noise, like, but really? Because there's so many other issues that need to be observed. If you're trying to focus, for example, in terms of a generativist approach, and you're trying to find the use of the access to universal grammar, then you are going to find it, I think, in a sense. So I think we need other perspective, people that are constantly criticizing or putting these issues into perspective in order to move forward. And I think complex and dynamic systems theory is all about that. It's not leaving any stone unturned. We need to observe everything and be open to whatever other disciplines may tell us about the process, because it may be accurate for sure.
Yeah. That's why I definitely prefer additional languages or target languages. Yeah. Just kind of be able to move around that whole idea of, Anyway, you know what? I just want to say I was so impressed, Constanza. And like I said, I love your edginess. Just keep pushing the boundaries. You know, your writing is amazing. I think I love, if I were your reviewer, I would just say, go for it. Let's publish it as is. But you might find some more conservative reviewers who want you to be more academic in your writing. And you know what I'm going to tell you? No. I loved it. And I saw personality in it. Academics don't like to have personality, right? But you know what? You're going to find a really cool path. And I just want you to maintain that authenticity in your writing, in the way that, you move forward, because I sensed a really authentic writer. And just don't let people tell you that you have to be stodgy. And I'm glad that Miguel was your thesis advisor, because he allowed you to be you. That was cool.
Absolutely, yes. Great support.
Okay, I'm done. So Miguel, over to you.
Thank you, Tammy. Yes, it was a real pleasure to work with Constanza, and this is the case in which the student overcomes his supervisor, because
Yeah,
yes,
she sounds like a lady who's not going to be listening much to you, Miguel.
with very little hints, she goes her way, and she flies high. So it was a real pleasure to work with her, and I really thank you, Paul, to be part of this enterprise. And I have just one last question for Constanza, and it deals with so what is your message for people that are working there with learners? Because here you have constructed a profile of a learner that include issues like cosmopolitanism, progressiveness. The message is that the teacher that is there teaching second language learners needs to provide this sort of context for the second language acquisition process to be successful. That is, what will be the favorable conditions under which your subject learned that can be replicated into a learning context?
I think this question really resonates with me as a teacher, because I am a teacher of English in the university. And I think we spend, or at least in our curriculum, which is very strict, we focus a lot on contents and very little on thinking about thinking, you know, a metacognitive sort of approach to learning a new language. So I think the message for me is to give some time to rethink the process and to allow for students to think about it themselves. Regarding, for example, cosmopolitanism and progressivism, I really think you can't force those kinds of values upon a student. I think they have to discover it themselves, in a sense. And I think that's something quite special maybe about learning languages, is that when we learn new languages, in this case, I'm just hypothesizing, of course, we sort of become open towards other cultures and other people. And so I think it's sort of like a given to become more progressive when you're learning languages, when you're open to learning new languages. So instead of saying, okay, maybe we should explore cosmopolitanism or progressivism, as this case showed, I think what we need is to allow for students to think about the process, to think about themselves as learners, to promote those kinds of conversations, like what works for you, what is fun for you, what makes you passionate about language. I would avoid anything that's dull and you know, frustrating about language learning, so students can really find their path in language learning. Because in the moment when the students find a wall, like I don't want to do this anymore, that means we've failed, I think. So I would promote a wider conversation on how we learn instead of language itself.
Okay, good. Thank you, Constanza.
No,
And now, yes, Domingo, now you are in charge of...
Y ahora voy a poner en pausa la grabación.
So welcome back, Constanza. Actually, it was not hard for the three of us to evaluate your presentation. The three of us were very pleased with your work, and you did excellent. And we were just saying that, at least in my experience, it has been one of the best theses that I have supervised, and my colleagues now in the US share the same opinion. And in terms of numbers, you get the highest grade possible. That is a 7 for this presentation. It was very clear, and then you addressed the questions right straight to the point, and you did not beat around the bushes with anything. It was very, very clear, and that was good. So that's the 7. And then Dr. Roman is saying that your grade point average in the program is 6.3, the grades. And then in your thesis, you have a 7 in the written report, and you have a 7 now in this oral presentation. So the final average in your studies in the master's program in the linguistics is a 6.7. Okay. So it is, and then you deserve it. You were one of the best students that I've had in when we started, and I remember that was the first time that I was in charge of teaching the SLA course, and it was good to have you there because you pushed me into setting up a course that would address the high quality standards that you have. So it was a pleasure, and it was a great experience. So I'm going to give the turn to Tammy or Paul if they want to say something.
I do. Am I on?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
You know what? Constanza, you and I do very similar things. And I can't wait to see your work being published, because I know it's going to be published. So do you have a home for for where you're going to publish your thesis?
I'm looking at the Journal of Metacognitive Studies, and I've seen others of multilingualism. I'm trying to adapt the thesis right now, both in terms of length and in terms of register, because of what you mentioned.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I'm thinking you could milk this puppy for probably 3 or 4 publications. I mean, there's a lot in there. When you take, I mean, if you take a look at different things, you could easily take a look at it from a complexity perspective and what you did with complexity. You could take a look at it from a metacognition perspective and what happened with metacognition. Right? You could take a look at it from multilingualism and look at it from that perspective. So it all depends on the research question you want to ask in order to get the data from what you've done. So I think you can milk this one. You've got some really, really good data. So don't put all your eggs in one basket with one journal and with one specific idea, because you've got a lot of ideas going on there. You know what? If you need any advice on where you might publish something, because you do a lot of what I do, let me know, because there's
that would be great. Yes, yeah.
Index journals out there that would take what you're doing. Take a look, like for example at TAPSLA, SSLLT. They're both Scopus indexed, and their turnaround time is quite quick.
Okay, yeah, that sounds perfect. Maybe I can write you an email.
Yep, write me an email, and I'll just, I'll give you a leg up.
Right, amazing. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Okay.
Constanza, I just wanted to say a few things that I've already said, but I really like the fact that you turn strategies on their head and you've opened us up to new ways of looking at strategies. And you're saying that the strategies from the 1990s are outdated and really need to be updated. So that may be part of your new house additions, maybe working along those lines or in some fashion, even maybe theoretically. And your graphics are superb, as I noted in my comments in the oral, in my written comments. It's just so exciting to see you talk about something, analyze it, and then create a beautiful graphic that displays it so perfectly. And it gives people immediate access to your thinking on it, and to see how all the factors interact. And then finally, as Tammy had suggested, you're building that house, and I like the fact that you had this framework that you see as your house to move forward and to add to and to reconstruct and to repaint and everything else. And I like that metaphor, and I'm so glad that you're thinking about that, so your future is projected forward, because you have a great future ahead of you. And keep me posted, please, when you get this published. I really want to see it, okay?
I'm so honored and so ecstatic about all your comments. And of course, I'm very grateful of Professor Miguel. He was the best supervisor I could ever hope for. It was an amazing process. I'm very happy that I could show you my results. In terms of the graphs, for example, that for me is also, it really resonates with the thesis, because I have so much fun doing that.
Yeah.
So I'm very glad that that my style and my insights really worked for this semester. So thank you so much. I can't really express how grateful I am and how happy I am. So thank you so much.
Gracias, Constanza. So thank you, Tammy, and thank you, Paul. I'll be sending you the acta for this for you to sign, and I will ask Paul to sign it first and then send it to Tammy. I'll sign it myself, and then that will be the route.
Okay.
Gracias, Domingo, por esto. Y estoy contento que hayas conocido a los profesores, ahora que tú eres director del programa, porque ellos han siempre colaborado con el Magíster por un largo tiempo y son una excelente contribución al programa.
Go Usach, go Usach.
Muchísimas gracias, Miguel.
Ya.
Gracias, Constanza. Por favor, exprésale a los profesores en tu buen manejo del inglés, que para mí ha sido un placer también conocerlos y que espero que sigamos en contacto, y reitérale mi agradecimiento por todo el apoyo que nos han brindado, no solamente en esta ocasión. Y bueno, me despido yo. Constanza, muchas gracias por tu presentación. Te dejo invitada para que converses con tu profesor, para que vean la posibilidad de concretar una publicación con esta investigación. Te dejo, Miguel, entonces, para que le
Gracias.
a los profesores.
Sí. Bueno, Paul y Tammy entienden bien el castellano, así que what Domingo is saying is giving you thanks to Tammy and Paul, and to keep in touch. Okay, so it was a good.
El placer fue nuestro.
Adiós.
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 Constanza.
Felicitaciones. Chao.
Chao, nos vemos.
Nos vemos.
Muchas gracias.
Chao.